All right, nice. All right, let's see if I get this in the first shot. This is the Doctor Ross Basketball Podcast, the blueprint to play professional basketball. I'm with my new friend Max. I'm gonna mess it up. Give me some help.
Schmarzo. I'm bad with names, so I hold
Schmarzo.
no. Yeah,
all right, good.
Schmarzo.
You're good with your own name. That's good. So we have a lot to discuss. So I want to get right into it. So Max, what's your global outlook on training? What makes a good training program from the most general point of view you can kind of see?
It's a tough question because it's always contextual, but I'll do my best to answer it. Depending on your situation, you should always have a well-identified goal, something that you can objectively showcase whether or not you were successful at achieving it. Whether you're talking about business or whether you're talking about training someone to jump higher, you should have a goal, and then whether or not you reach that goal safely and successfully is the most minimal terms of success, right? So it's an inarguable objective qualification of a successful program. And if you're safe and healthy in doing such and you achieve your goal, I don't care if you pick dandelions, it's a successful program. Yeah. And so the more pragmatic and objective we can be, the better we can resolve problems that seem to be and are very complicated and complex, those two being distinct in nature and the definitions. So the easy answer is you're successful in doing what you do, but also that embodies much more than just achieving a goal. Obviously, if you're working with people in the private sector, you should be enjoyable as a person. Like they need to train with you. And so hopefully personality trickles in there as well and all these other non-training related variables, but in the most minimal sense, it is, are you actually successful in achieving your goal? And contingent on that is your ability to actually construct goals. And that's something any trainer, any strength coach, any physical therapist, or heck, even anybody should really understand, what is your goal? And then we can better define its success. So that's kind of the global answer, I guess, to a very global question.
Yeah, and a lot of times, like when I think of a goal, I see people, and especially like on TikTok. Now I'm on TikTok a lot. They'll be like, best way to improve your vertical jump, and I see like the side planks, like all these different exercises. In my head, I'm like, all right, I'm really stupid. I don't know anything. If I want to do something better, I want to do that thing because I'm gonna get all the adaptations that come with doing that thing. And that should be step one. Is that how you kind of look at things?
Yeah. So now you've opened a can of worms because you're diving into causal relationships. And so in the world of academia and science, I say we like I'm a scientist, people who enjoy science, they isolate variables. So if I do a study and I want to understand if doing a plank or doing a squat or eating strawberries is going to help me jump higher, I'm going to have some type of a control group and some type of an experimental group. And in doing such, I hope to isolate the effectiveness of eating strawberries in my ability to jump high. However, we know as humans, no single variable is going to be the determinant variable. And so it's not like lifting weights is going to be the sole purpose why you jump high, because we're always governed by a central controller that is our brain. So we use linear analysis to understand nonlinear systems, nonlinear system being your body. And so a body is more like an interconnected web of nodes, and your outcome variable, jumping high, can manifest in many different ways. Some people can do it because they have really strong legs. Some people convert horizontal velocity very well. Some people do it because they have more innate fiber types. So whatever reason that might be. But at the end of the day, we could never, as practitioners, perfectly isolate every variable. So we have to then work from the top-down approach. So academia and research kind of does the bottoms up. Let's isolate and extrapolate. We have to then look at the mover and say, look, if I know jumping helps them, at a bare minimum, jumping to the goal, I should say, we know jumping will help them jump higher. And then I can attempt to work down and say, well, what's limiting their ability to jump high? Is it the explosiveness in their legs? What exercise and assessments can I use to, isolate somewhat the legs? And so now we're pairing the practitioner, which is kind of the macro view backwards, with the micro view forwards of academia, and trying to mix the two together. So it's hard to say like, oh, this is how I do it with an athlete, because it's very much dependent on the individual. If someone's trying to make it to the NBA, I don't really care if they jump high or run fast. The program becomes a connection of a whole. So it's not like I'm just training to jump high. I'm training or helping them, be the best player they can be, which means at times I told them not to lift much weight because they're more effective and more likely to make their position if they work on their skills. And so I know it's kind of a little bit of a tangent, but it kind of pairs the two, or at least juxtaposes the isolated mindset of typically like, oh, a strength coach, we just want to lift weights. But really, we got to understand that's only a very small piece of the puzzle that puts together that athlete's grand goal, which is probably not being a great weightlifter. It's probably being a great athlete. And at times, their ability to express athleticism is so much higher than that of other skills like shooting or ball handling, if we're talking about basketball, that time is best allocated to those skills versus the actual weightlifting. And as a strength coach, having a sense of that can be very beneficial. So we actually work towards improving a positive outcome, getting towards whatever their athletic goals is versus just getting stronger.
Yeah. No, and honestly, like nobody thinks like that. Like strength coaches think, what is the last 10% that I could do from a strength coach perspective to improve this person? But honestly, if you're thinking in the mindset of, all right, I'm worried about what are they doing on the court? What are they doing in the weight room? What are they doing recovery wise? Like all these things, they have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of energy. So it's like, great, you can go like stretch, and I'm going to tell you to stretch for 20 minutes after your workout, even though you don't like to do it, not saying not to stretch, but you don't like to do it. And it's probably not doing much for you from a recovery standpoint. Why don't you take that 20 minutes and spend it on the court if you can get to a court, and just like start to find out what are the best ways you could spend your time as an athlete.
And that comes down to the structure of what we operate in. So if you're in a private setting, it's different, but if you're in a public school setting and you're a strength coach, you don't have the control. You're actually not even held accountable technically to the players, because as a professional, you got to understand what you're being held accountable for to deem your success. And your employer might justify success through one lens versus the players justifying it through another. Okay. So while your employer might say, look, I need you just to focus on getting them really strong, here's the allotted time. Well, then that responsibility is now placed on me to fulfill my employer's needs, versus the athlete might say, I'd rather shoot hoops. Well, you're not the employer in this case. So the paradigm of control has shifted from what would be a scholastic in that study. I'm kind of referencing the school settings, some grand architect, maybe the AD or the coach or whomever it might be, versus in an individual world where you might have more control. But again, not in team settings typically.
Yeah, I like having all the control. I'd rather have all the control possible, be able to do whatever I want.
And then you burden all the failures, which is quite a burden that it's very difficult. So it has promises to it, and also has unfortunate innate drawbacks.
Yeah, you were touching upon so different parts of our system that you have to kind of, as objectively as possible, see like, all right, does this person need to work on this to balance their system, this to balance their system? Just as far as producing power, because I wanted to talk about this, force velocity profiling. Do you do it? How do you do it? If you do it, how do you measure it? Do you use like sprinting? Do you use it? I mean, of course, it'll depend on the person's needs and goals, but say like somebody did want to jump higher or sprint faster, what would you do? Would you separate how you would objectively measure?
It's a tough question. So we're just talking about purely jump height versus acquisition of that jump height into a skill is kind of two different entities. In short, I'll do a short explanation of a complex system to help give some background, and I'll give a really simple answer. So in a complex system, we have what's called distinction and integration. So if we think about it in terms of a car, which even though a car is a simple system, a complex system has the master controller, that is your brain. And imagine yourself, you're going to go fix, I don't know, a bench in your garage that you need to fix. I don't know why, but you're doing it. And you have a toolbox, and you have a hammer, you have a saw, and you have some really crappy nails, but you have some good screws. So you decide to use a screw, but your screwdriver kind of stinks too, but you go get a better screwdriver so you can use your screws. We can think about each of these tools and the screws or whatever applications we have as parts of our body. You can think about like your muscles, your tendons, And you, the master controller, in this case, your body, the brain, has to select what tools are going to be best used to solve the problem of fixing a bench, or the analogy would be jumping high. And so if you want to jump higher, your body is going to have to not just select the right tools, but if you can provide it with new and better tools, like a better screwdriver or not rusty nails that would work better, then it has the potential to jump even higher. And so that's where the idea of force velocity profiling comes in, is we attempt to identify a certain area that the body is potentially lacking, either in the amount of force it can produce. We can use force in this case. You can use it in basically similar to, it's obviously not the same as load. So we're typically talking about load velocity profiling. We're talking about force velocity profiling for those at home. Because you're going to lift a weight, you're not actually measuring newtons on the ground, different topic, whatever. But you're going to identify what areas are kind of weak relative to other areas that might be strong. So an example would be if I'm doing a force velocity profile, or the load velocity profile of a trap bar jump, I am assessing the ability of the athlete to see how fast they can lift a trap bar at a given set of velocities. We know velocity and load have an inverse relationship, at least in the quasi-controlled setting. When you talk about dynamic movements, it gets a little hairier. But the idea is that when you lift like a trap bar and you lift a really heavy weight, you're going to innately lift it slower. And if you're going to lift a really light weight, you're going to, when you try as hard as you can, you're going to lift it really fast. And that relationship is what we call a linear relationship. So those remember the y equals mx plus b, your rise and run, your slope, and all that fun stuff, like your y-intercept, that's where it comes from. You can actually mathematically plot this, and you can determine based on some relationships, if you're doing, for example, jump height versus just speed, jump height being representative of takeoff velocity, because velocity load, for you physics nerds out there, it's jump height and velocity takeoff is technically the same, because that determines how high you jump. You can plot those, and you can use what J.B. Moore has a method, Carmelo Bosco has a method to look at whether or not you have deficiencies in certain areas. So you say, look, this person might be better suited. They're really strong, but they're not very good at accelerating a light load. They need to work on lighter movements that will more optimize their ability to produce force against higher velocities. The reason this kind of comes about is because we're thinking about jumping. We have to overcome inertia, that is gravity pushing us downward. And at a certain point, it's not just about how much force you can produce in a non-constrained time, like a squat where you have all day in the world to lift it. But once you start moving your body and produce that initial bit of force, it starts to move faster. So the demands on your ability to continue to accelerate your center of mass upward is dependent on your ability to continue to produce velocity or force at a continuously higher velocity. So if you were to plot your velocity over time, over a force time graph, for example, or force your velocity time graph, your center of mass will get its most sharpest acceleration at the very beginning, then it struggles because your body doesn't continue to produce, in this case, force against a higher or a lighter load, which is faster velocity. And so the idea of force velocity, to wrap it all together, is simply to look at the relationship between how much weight you lift, kind of, and the speed you lift it at, and then how much weight you lift a really lightweight. And sometimes people lift really heavy weights really well, but not really light weights that well. And so they need to work more on light weights. And you can say, look, that's going to potentially help their quads, and quads are an important role in jumping, and that's going to help optimize their force velocity profile. So therefore, they can potentially jump higher, assuming their brain is able to use these newfound tools, which we can probably assume is pretty much okay in a very much a controlled vertical setting, to then jump higher. So that's kind of the long-winded explanation of a simple answer.
No, that was good. I like that. I'm going to steal that. So what about this? So it makes sense, like mechanistically, and like also like the literature would support that you can get better outcomes if you profile this way for certain tasks. So it would depend. But what about like a situation where so in my head, this is like more of a question. In my head, it's more of like a muscle ability, and it's also a total movement ability, but it's like, what is the muscle's ability to actually produce force? And it's also like this connective tissue. But like, is there ever a time where it's like, all right, well, maybe this person comes out as, all right, they need more force, so they need more load, and that's probably going to help them more, or they need less load. But maybe on the flip side, like say they needed less load, but say like you had a hunch, or you could measure this somehow, where they needed more like tendon stiffness and you wanted to really focus on that. So you wanted to do whatever you wanted to do in that scenario. Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah, and it's very, you can't measure tendon stiffness, unfortunately, at the moment without using certain imaging. There's a paper on it that just came out in 2020. That was, I think it's 2020. It was lower than that, whatever, about ideas of optimizing tendon stiffness relative to muscle tendon unit architecture. And basically, they would assess tendon strain and relative strain at maximal voluntary contraction to see, is there enough, or is there how much stiffness essentially the tendon has relative to the muscle's ability to produce force. Interesting paper, but you can't basically, they're like, you can't measure it unless you got our tools. So unfortunately, we can't do that. But if we were to hypothetically understand that someone does need these kind of things, we have to understand stiffness versus mechanical stiffness. And there's a big difference between the two. Anytime we're talking about movement, it's easy to look at it purely from a mechanical standpoint and say, you know what are the physical properties that are producing force? And it's very easy to look at it like we're a machine. But this machine also has a computer chip in it that is your brain that organizes it. So when we talk about ability to express greater amounts of force or even stiffness, there is joint active stiffness versus mechanical just tendon stiffness. So one situation, we're assessing the soft tissue's ability to resist deformation against an amount of force, which that is stiffness. But if we're looking at systemic stiffness, you're looking at your body to resist deformation or center of mass deformation upon force. And those two are not necessarily the same, because systemic stiffness is actually a means which your body learns to either use. Your body has a means to either be viscous or elastic. So it's a viscoelastic system. And essentially when you hit the ground, if it deems it to be a dangerous hit, so it's like a fall, you have a safety mechanism, i.e. a survival mechanism, they call it, or survival reflex, it will attempt to dampen the fall. So by doing this, it will try to dissipate forces because it deems those forces too great. Think about jumping off of a really high box. Instead of trying to rebound high off of it, you'll just want to try and land safely. Versus if we are to hit the ground and it's a comfortable enough box, we can use that kinetic energy of the fall to augment our following jump. So then we jump higher because we use those kinetic forces. And in that case, we were elastic. We optimize our stiffness properties systemically to allow for greater stored elastic utilization, free energy in our soft tissues. And so if I were to say, look, I want in theory some greater tendon stiffness, there are some means to do it. Things like isometrics, things like heavier. I mean, there's a lot of research. Dr. Keith Barr, great area to look at. Jake Tura on Instagram too, some really good stuff as well. But you can do isometrics, you can do heavy lifting. Those have all been leaning towards the idea of developing tendon stiffness with proper nutrition as well, which can augment the adaptation of the collagen matrix in the tendon itself. But we can't just get caught up in that mechanistic process, because if I'm looking at an athlete observationally and I purely assume the lack of ground contact time is due to tendon stiffness, I'm going to be chasing a mechanical factor, which with better cueing or better teaching, the learned pattern of stiffness manifests itself prominently and it's done appropriately. So maybe I was just wasting my time chasing tendon stiffness as the fault variable versus the actual means of skill being the issue when we look at that as a whole. So yes, you can do tendon stiffness type training. You can do it for many different reasons beyond just quote unquote a stiff tendon. There are benefits for collagen matrix turnover. They talk about the means of analgesic effect of possibly reducing some of the nociceptive pain regions in that area as well. But there are also some benefits from the actual structural alignment. But to isolate that as the only variable, we'll have to isolate every single tendon then that's used in movement, because we can't just pretend like only the major tendons are important. And then that becomes kind of a rabbit hole that might not be very fruitful.
Yeah. And that goes back to the same thing, like top-down approach. If you take a top-down approach, you're probably in the ballpark a little bit more. So how do you, if you do, objectively see like, all right, does this person need to work on their ability to, like, their ground contact time, they need to decrease it? Like what, and it would depend on their goals and their needs. How do you look at that?
Yeah, you can simply measure it. Like a drop jump as an example. Can they do the lowest level of a drop jump off an 8-inch box without pain and maintain a good ground contact time, say around 300 to 350 milliseconds, maybe even faster, 200, 250 milliseconds, without pain, and be able to jump as high as they can afterwards. So the ability to actually sustain a ground contact time under low force demands. And if they're able to do it under low force demands, but then fail to do it under higher force demands, you could at least make a debate and say, look, it's probably not skill because they express the skill under lower loads. And so maybe at this point in time, that's mechanical that they're failing. So either that's because they have showcased the skill, they've proven it once, they can do it, and you coach it a couple times, they're still not doing it. We can maybe assume that's not totally skill related, that it could be actual inabilities to produce enough force fast enough. So that's one means you can do it. That's probably the easiest way to do it, in my opinion, because if you understand the means of stiffness and the means of how you calculate that, reactive strength index, or the ability to maintain a ground contact time, and then look at it in regards to their jump height, is a good inferential metric to that. So, I mean, that's the easiest one. You can watch it visually. Is it a 2-part movement? Is it a 1-part movement? And then you got to be aware, like, are they not being quick off the ground because their arm swing is lagging? Is that an issue? Because you have to look at other confounding variables that could be getting in the way of your interpretation of the information, without just saying, oh, they have a long ground contact time. Yeah, but they do it like, they don't do the movement very well. If you just coach the movement better, they could do it better. And then therefore it kind of brings up the, question. Then they can do it right and they're still not doing it, then maybe we have an issue.
So if somebody does have if like very clear, they have a long ground contact time, how does your training differ? What are you going to do differently as far as plyometrics go, or strength training? What are you looking at?
Yeah, we can assume in a situation, maybe the person in this case has weak ankles. You can make that assumption through other areas. We could say the gastroc soleus maybe isn't acting stiff enough as a spring and more as a dampener during the majority of the movement. So it's causing the other areas to then ripple down effect. So they're more knee dominant and they're just kind of making a 2-part movement during a jump. So if that's the case, you got to look at 2 things. And if you look at Davis's law, it's basically the idea that tissue follows function. And so if you keep training a specific area, tissue reformation and modeling follows those strain lines. And so we can assume then skill and physiology in this case they synergistically work together for better or for worse. So this person's been doing plyometrics, but they've been doing long ground contact time. Well, all they're doing is then continually adapting the area that produces long ground contact time. So they're reinforcing a bad habit, not just neurologically, but also physiologically. So then to break the skill, you have to assess, how can I get this person to perform the movement correctly, i.e. maybe doing band-assisted movement to a point where force becomes such a minimal factor, but then also strengthen other areas that we can then utilize when we go into more demanding movement, assuming that it follows a similar strain pattern. So maybe light pulsing soleus work, light pulsing calf work, rhythmic quarter squat work, light loads, working on the ability to have a rapid reversal within specific joint angles. And then once that person progresses out of that band assisted movement or some other lighter version, we kind of marry the two without having to worry about, now we have a bad pattern the minute we got a band assisted movement because the other tissues weren't strong enough. So it's kind of like a neurophysiological coupling of the two, but appreciating that they both kind of have similar yet different mechanisms.
Yeah. What is that looking at? So looking at one workout, one exercise, even one set, what does that look like? Are you what are you focusing on? Are you focusing on like heavily on the quality of the reps? Does it depend on what you're going for if you're going to focus on that quality more or less?
Well, it's always going to be dependent on how the rep is done. If we assume that adaptation follows strain and how we do something manifests strain, then we need to make sure our reps are done appropriately. Granted, we also got to understand that if someone's doing a complex movement the first time, if they did the rep right the first time, you probably wouldn't need to have a job anyway. So there's going to be a learning curve to just about anything. So we're going to try and do our best reps. Not every rep is going to be perfect, but that's our goal still, right?
Yeah.
And so what it would look like, you look at a day of someone who maybe is just kind of very early on in that process. We might do something like we'll do quarter rhythm squats with 20 pounds in each hand, assuming that they have adequate. This is assuming the person's relatively strong, by the way, because there are some different means that you might dive into there. If it's just a lack of general strength. But maybe some rhythm type squats. Maybe you'll do some soleus calf raises, some bent knee calf raises. But prior to that, you'd be doing some sort of contrast circuit to kind of attempt to teach the movement a little better. So you might do band-assisted pogo jumps with a light band assistance, and then body weight submaximal effort pogo jumps. to work on the ability to actively produce stiffness and actually get a ground contact time that's quick enough. And then we follow all that up with some isometrics at the end, because we want to make sure that if we're putting new demands on tendons, that we take care of things that could possibly help reduce the likelihood of tendonitis. So that's kind of like the very low level entry point of that. And you can take that across the spectrum, moving up and down based on needs.
Yeah. No, yeah. So it's like, all right, so that makes sense. And then from a quality standpoint, so like, say you want somebody to keep their velocity high, say that's your goal as far as quality goes of the set. I personally am like, all right, 10%, and this is just so robotic because it's just what everyone that I hear smart says. So I stick with that number. Is that like a stupid number to stick with if I'm trying to be with quality, or what?
Yeah, it's, you're talking about a velocity drop off. If when we do a movement, for listeners who aren't familiar, you get fatigued as you get tired, the speed of the movement drops. And it's commonly recommended 5%, 10%, 15%, 25%. There's kind of differences in the literature. People would say 10 because it's easy to calculate probably. If you see, 0.98, you just minus 0.98. It becomes easy math-wise. So I think by default, 10 has become the nomenclature people go with, or the standard people go with. Honestly, I don't really program velocity as much, just because I keep the reps so low. It's almost, what's the point? I'm doing like 2 reps with the athlete. Will we measure velocity during the movement? Yeah, of course. It adds a little bit of competitive atmosphere, and we'll be able to see if we're getting moving weight faster. I'm not using a velocity drop off in that case, just because it
doesn't matter. You're gonna stay below it.
Yeah. It's 2 reps at like 25%. So if you can, if you're not maintaining velocity on that, it's either I put the wrong weight on the bar. But if you get more specific, then you might want to. So it depends what your goal is and what you've done previously that day, because that's one of many factors. I've done 30, 40, 50 jumps prior to that. We weren't tracking velocity there, so I'm going to pretend to myself that this is perfect max peak velocity is already performing. I don't know if that's true. It makes me a little bit on murky water, so I just tend to operate in areas I understand, and that's what I feel comfortable with, is just doing 2 and 3 reps, because it tends to work.
Yeah, and like that's my thing. Like when I'm on TikTok, like if I'm seeing a video, or on social media on Instagram, I see a video, and it's like, first thing in my head is like, all right, what am I missing here if I don't see how it's going? And I used to be like insecure. Like if I were to see something that I didn't know, it's like, oh, I really don't know shit. But then I see things and I'm like, all right, what is the point of this? Like this person has this whole following, and they're telling all these young athletes, you want to get your bounce up? And maybe I'm wrong, but I want you 100 tuck jumps in a row, like, and try and jump as high as you can each time in one set, like without stopping. So it's like, all right, in my head, all right, that's probably not going to optimize what you're trying to do, because your quality is going to be so low. What would you think about something like that? Should I be thinking about different adaptations that could potentially be happening with something like that?
I mean, I think in any situation, a lot of the burden is placed on the consumer. The individuals I deal with typically might be different than other people deal with. And that's natural, and that's fine. But again, like if someone's proposing a method, there are methods that people, I mean, you can get a lesser version of a car too, I guess. It's not up to whomever, it's not to me to regulate that, in my opinion. And I don't know the person, and maybe I'll share insights if someone has a specific question on it. But again, if the consumer wants to buy, Nike versus Adidas, or Reebok versus Adidas, whatever shoe brand they want to go with, that's cool. And maybe they'll like it and it works for them, and that's their cup of tea. And maybe it's not. For me, I have too many concerns immediately with individuals I'm working with that, I see stuff online. It's hard not to be like, oh, what's this? But at the end of the day, I have my own situation I need to be worried about. And so I just try my best to focus on that, unless that and somehow becomes a question within my realm that I'm actively needing to get over, an obstacle I need to face. I don't really have much of an opinion on it.
Gotcha. What else do we have? So a specific question, and we'll go for another like 5 minutes or so. French contrast method or other contrast methods, what is the benefit of them? Is potentiation actually going to happen when you are, like, is the benefits of potentiation or this neurological thing going to happen when you lift heavy loads, or maybe when you lift light loads? So does it depend on what, if you lift light loads, if you use accommodating resistance, if you just do really heavy stuff? What are your thoughts on potentiation in general?
It's I wouldn't use a contrast series for potentiation unless you're using a two-load mechanism. We have one heavier load and one lighter load, but that's specifically a potentiation, almost cluster or complex that you might call it. A contrast, in my opinion, is contrasting loads through the same movement expression in an attempt to educate the nervous system. It's more of a motor learning process than
Yeah.
it is a neurological phenomenon of being able to have some magical thing where you're producing more force and jumping higher. If you think about it like this, think about every time you train, it's about your environment and you adapt to your environment, but sometimes you also stagnate within your environment. So if you just keep jumping with body weight, you're not going to eventually jump any higher. And so the idea is that maybe you'll contrast that body weight and jump with different loads, whether it's a band assisted movement, it's a vertical squat, it's a loaded jump, it's a body weight jump. The idea is the intent and the kind of the sensory, the somatosensory motor program, your body's visualizing that it's a vertical jump every time. And so by the time you go to your body weight jump, it had to solve a similar problem in a different environment. So when it faces your body weight environment, it potentially has a new solution for firing patterns that might be more, it might yield greater utility than otherwise learned before.
Yeah, it's just like motor learning, like the literature around motor learning and like random practice and block practice. Like if you use random practice, you could kind of triangulate the skill a little bit better. If you're, say you're hitting a golf ball with a bunch of different clubs, a bunch of different places, you'll learn what it takes to hit a golf ball better. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Essentially, yeah, that's my understanding of its backbone, where it came from.
Yeah, 100%. Last thing I had a question on. So for potentiation, to my understanding, like the best way to actually get a benefit of potentiation other than just increasing muscle temperature would be to use either accommodating resistance or use like overspeed training, or like the baseball players study whatever with the bat and like using heavy loads. Like they felt like they were swinging harder, but they're actually swinging slower. And when you use like a wiffle ball bat, it's faster. What do you think about that?
I think potentiation is kind of a, it's useful, I guess, for single specific purposes. I've kind of fallen off the train of potentiation personally. I just don't know the utility of it based on the time requirements to actually elicit the proper post-activation potentiation response. I'm not sure if I want to have an athlete rest for 5 minutes in my workout. I don't know how many sets we're ever going to do if that's the case. And then I don't know if there's any studies showcasing that long-term use of potentiation yields super maximal benefits.
Yeah.
So is it a parlor trick, or is it actually an adaptive phenomenon? And is it just a representation of the adaptations that might take place from the previous exercise you just did? Yeah. So you almost induced a short-term super compensation, which might be useful if you're trying to go max out and throw down your first dunk. Right on. Yeah. Cool. But or is it, the benefit we're seeing simply because you just squatted something heavy? If you just squat heavy long enough with enough intent, that potentiated jump is going to be your normal jump. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know enough. I know there's some, physiological speculation around calcium sensitivity and maybe some neurophenomena as well in regards to firing rate or organization or synchronization. I just don't know the adaptive response that would take place long-term to it. Doesn't mean you can't do it. I've just begun to favor more just contrast series in terms of being able to expose different environments to a same motor pattern as opposed to it being eliciting some super maximal response. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. All right, that's good. That's everything. Awesome.
Yeah,
cool.
Thank you
I
so
appreciate
much.
you. Thanks for having me on. I'm glad I could be the first guest on here, and hopefully you get many more to come after.
Yeah, hopefully it blows up.
Yeah, it never hurts to have a conversation in this regard and a good talk, and hopefully people can take away from it. Again, my biggest thing is like, performance is confusing. I've worked at many different levels in the realm of performance and science, and the idea that we understand things is a fallacy because research doesn't understand things fully. The fact that we pretend, and I'll use that word sincerely because I think we've all been there, that we understand every reason why something is done is unfortunately more of a verbal security blanket or a marketing scheme or some sort of means in between than it is reality. But then again, people don't like to hear that you don't know.
Yeah.
The most positive environments I've been in and working with athletes is when we can both work on the same team, understanding that we're just trying to do the best to solve a problem. And so anyone who's working with a client, I think it's really important to have the client heavily involved. I think it's important to have them share their opinion. If they're educated in their area, voice the opinion. Ask them if they like that movement. Ask them what movements they don't like. Try and make this a cooperative experience, because the irony of it, if you're a strength coach, more times than not, you probably wouldn't listen to another strength coach trying to coach you up one-on-one in a program. Yet we're asking someone else to listen to us. Like those rules don't apply, because obviously we like to say things like, you know your body best, but I'm going to tell you what's best. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
If I'm living by that rule, I expect the individual I'm working with to probably live by that rule as well. And so the more we can make this a team effort, I think the better someone can get a result out of it, which is why social media is very important, because certain people can share certain things that you might not have realized or known or seen, whether it is an active coach or whether it's an athlete themselves that they enjoy. But then it's our burden to digest that information and realize whether or not it fits in the context that we're operating in, or is it something we can hang on to for a later date that might make more sense then.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of
Awesome.
sense.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. I see this jersey. What jersey do we have on?
We got LeBron. He lost me too much for me to say, but I had a parlay with him in the Nets. Whatever. I have a nice KD rookie card, so hopefully that goes through the roof.
There we go.
See what happens.
I think actually, if you're LeBron, I went back and I used to collect cards when I was little, and I have somewhere in the house a serial number LeBron rookie card, I believe. Yeah, I know. We found it recently, and it was worth might have made up all of our collecting worth. we still might be in the loss of how much we collected cards.
Wow.
I'm not a big collector anymore. I used to be very big into it. And so unfortunately, I had like Anthony Hardaway serial number rookie cards, which he didn't pan out. Unfortunately, just some injuries. It would have been cool.
Yeah.
But we do have the LeBron one somewhere, I know for sure. And it's cased up. It was cased up and put into a sleeve the minute I got it.
Wow.
And so I assume it's in mint condition. I didn't play with basketball cards. I play with Pokemon cards. I have all of them, but those things are so handled. My first edition Charizard looks like it went through a bike spoke.
You had a first edition. What are the types of Charizards you can get?
We had all of them. I had 3, 4, 5, 7 first edition holographic Dark Charizards.
Me too, yeah.
I had about 4 or 5 originals. We got into it very early. And so we have cases of, not cases, I have a big box full of old, not sealed at all anymore, but first edition, basically every Pokemon you can think of. But they're thumbed through the nth degree. We played with them, right?
Me too.
I didn't collect them. That was Yu-Gi-Oh too. So I had somewhere I have all the original, white, blue eyes, white.
Yeah, the dragon. Yeah.
All the originals. Unfortunately, we never kept any packs. So that was the disappointing situation with. I just held on to one pack, but I was a greedy little kid who just wanted to play with and open them all. So it's funny how that works. Maybe I'll find some case. We think my brother was more nerdy than me. And I think he cased all of them. So maybe somewhere there is a binder full of first edition holographic cards. But knowing myself, I probably was little and stole them all and used them. So I don't know. Who knows?
I tried to get into early collector. Gary V's V Friends. Mm-hmm. Copped nicely. I copped one.
I've removed myself from collecting all in all. It's something I enjoy, but I don't even know how to resell anything. And so when I did it, I loved it. I love playing the games. I played a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh. I didn't play Pokemon. You played the video game. No one played the board game. It stunk.
No.
Too slow a pace. But we played a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh. And we played all the video games. And so as a childhood, I guess looking back on it, I couldn't pay enough to enjoy those. So whatever price tag they had, I guess, could be regrettable now. But as a kid, you'd have no idea. I mean, who knew?
Yeah.
But we had the LeBron card. The whole point of it was the LeBron card. We went through it recently. We found it dug away somewhere. So we got to figure out what we're going to do with that. Once the PSA calms down, I might send it in.
Yeah, 100%. I still have some stuff at PSA, a bunch of Shea Gilgeous-Alexander cards that I sent back like 6 months ago. So
yeah, so I got this thing out there. So maybe I'll send you a pic over the TikTok if I can find it. See if you can.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm not even sure what it's. I have no idea. It's out there.
I'll look it up for you. 100%. Yeah.
I appreciate it, man. I'm glad we could end on a positive, non-training note. I can hop back on here and talk to you about card collecting more than training.
Yeah,
the true
100%.
passions.
Yeah, dude, I'm into it. Let's do it.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you, man. Thank you for having me on.
Yep. Thank you.